So my family and I exchange gifts every year. And for the adults, we don't really do gifts. We do stocking stuffers. And it's always nice when you can make something instead of buy it. So that's what I'm doing here by making these giant end grain cutting boards. But that presents two problems. One, a giant end grain cutting board is way too big to fit in a stocking. But that doesn't really matter. We just say they're stocking stuffers. They don't actually have to fit in a stocking. But the real problem is we have a self-imposed spending limit on these gifts. I think it's something like $20 or $50 or something, I don't know. Whatever it is, these cutting boards exceed it. And that's true whether you're talking about the value of the finished cutting board or the cost of the wood itself. But I have a solution. And that is I'm going to make 3 cutting boards. One for my sister and her family, one for my mom and dad, and one that I can sell and use the profit from that to pay for the other 2 boards. And if my calculations are correct, and we're just gonna say that they are, that would essentially make the cutting boards free. And free is definitely less than whatever the spending limit was that we had. And as for the size of the cutting boards, I just want them to be big. I want to make them as big as I can with the amount of wood that I have. And the dimensions that I'm kind of trying to stay around is around 24 inches by 18 inches. But whether they turn out to be 25 by 17 or 22 by 20 doesn't really matter. And I never really appreciated using a giant cutting board until I went to culinary school. But I'm no chef or anything. I just took some classes in my spare time. But having all that surface area to work on was so luxurious. Changed my life. I might be overstating it a bit. But the point is, if you never use a giant cutting board as opposed to one of the smaller ones, you don't know what you're missing. But my advice is if you want to make a cutting board of a particular size, then to start with one of those online calculators. They're super helpful. They're free. I'll put some links below, but they're really helpful for planning out your cutting board build. Because if you've never made an end grain cutting board before, it uses more wood than you think it does. Now, what you've been watching me do so far is milling the wood, which is taking it from rough lumber to square in preparation for the first glue up. Now, that's important for any project, but I think it's especially important for end grain cutting boards because you want to have as close to an invisible glue line as possible. Because that's kind of really the whole project, just a bunch of glue ups. So there's really nowhere to hide. So you want to do the best you can with making sure you start with square lumber, because that'll give you the best chance of making sure you have seamless glue joints. And with that cut, I am done milling my lumber, leaving me with perfectly square stock and a sawdust parfait. And one of the keys to ensure that you have a visually appealing end grain cutting board is to vary the grain direction. And that's what I'm doing here, by making sure that no 2 boards sitting next to each other have grain that's running the same direction. Of note though, sometimes it can be kind of hard to tell whether you're looking at the grain or the saw marks. If that's the case with you, just spray a little bit of water on the end grain and you'll be able to see the grain more easily. And I'm using Titebond 3 for the glue ups because it's food safe and it's water resistant. And fun fact, if you're like me and you bought a bunch of glue one time because it was on sale and now you're worried about it going bad before you get a chance to use it, Titebond says if the glue still flows, then it's still good. And the best way to keep it flowing is to store it in moderate temperatures. So if you're like me and you don't have a climate controlled shop, maybe think about storing your glue indoors. It'll make it last longer. Okay, so it's the next day now, and the next step for me is to run these through the drum sander to clean up the glue squeeze out and to flatten them up. Before I had a drum sander, I would glue these up into 2 smaller pieces, run those 2 small pieces through the planer, and then glue them up into one larger piece. And I actually wish I would have done that here because even though the drum sander is a super convenient tool to have, oh my goodness, is it slow. The drum sander earns more of its keep when you're sanding the end grain after the next glue up, But for the first glue up, the planer is the way to go. Plus, I really don't like changing out the paper in the drum sander, even though I am getting better at it. But that doesn't really matter, because as I mentioned in some of my previous videos, the drum sander doesn't have long for my shop. I'm going to be getting rid of it pretty soon. I just don't use it enough, but you kind of can't argue with the results. Okay, so I'm about to make the last cuts that I'm going to make for these boards. And the important thing about these cuts is that the width of the strips that I cut are going to be the height or thickness of the cutting board. So I'm setting my stop block here to just over 2 inches because I know I'm going to lose a little bit of thickness when I do the sanding, and I want the boards to be 2 inches in thickness. And you'll notice that I'm using my crosscut sled for these crosscuts, which I'm using on my job site saw. And that's because even though I've had my cabinet saw for about a year now, I still haven't made or bought a crosscut sled for it. I feel like one of those fancy shops that have like a regular table saw and then a dado saw or something. Except I have a regular saw and then a crosscut saw. So whatever saw you have, whether it be a job site saw or a cabinet saw, just work with what you got. They'll all get the job done. Okay, so round 2 of addressing grain direction. If I do nothing, the pattern will repeat itself every row. But by turning every other row, it repeats itself every 2 rows. Then if I go through and flip every 3rd and 4th row, it'll repeat itself every 4 rows. Thus making the pattern look a lot more random. And you may not be able to see the difference in grain here yet, but you'll be able to see it a lot better after I sand them. But before that sanding, we've got one more glue up to do. And this glue up's going to go a lot like the last one, but there is a slight difference. On this glue up, it's much more important to have everything aligned. Especially if you're doing like a checkerboard pattern, you want to make sure that you have all the lines aligned. And one thing you might want to consider is putting cauls or some other kind of apparatus to keep these things flat, because whether you have a drum sander or not, sanding end grain is nobody's idea of a good time. So you want to have these things as flat as possible. So I run these through the drum sander, and now I'm just using my square and a track saw to square up one edge. This could have also been done using my crosscut sled, but I didn't feel like setting up my crosscut saw again. And I don't know if you noticed, but I was holding the track down while I was cutting because even though it's got a grippy bottom, if I don't have the clamps on, I never quite trust it to stay put while I'm cutting. I don't know, maybe it's just me. So as you can see, it made a nice clean cut, nice and square. So now I'm just going to take it over to the table saw to make the other side parallel. So even though I have a drum sander, as you can see, it tends to leave these pretty noticeable sanding lines. So after I make these cuts, I still have a lot of sanding to do with the random orbital sander. And for cutting boards, I usually sand it to 220, raise the grain, and sand 220 again. Now, the biggest problem I have with cutting boards of any size is the inability to slide whatever I'm cutting directly off of the cutting board onto a plate. Because of geometry and physics and such, when you slide a round plate up against a flat rectangular cutting board, when you try to then slide a bunch of diced onions off on the side, they're going to spill all over the place. And I'm already crying because I'm dicing onions, so I don't want to have to clean up a mess too. So I looked at the handholds and I thought, maybe I can cut out a plate-sized channel where the handholds go. I'll just use my dado stack, set the cutting board up on its side, and do a reverse plunge cut. Then all my problems will be solved. Now this technique is actually pretty easy. You just have to have some kind of a high fence to clamp your cutting board to, and you want to make sure that's centered over the dado stack. And I have a 3/4 inch stack in mine right now, so that's going to be the depth of my handhold. And from there, it's pretty simple. You just turn the saw on and slowly raise the blade. Now, obviously, the elephant in the room is that you actually have to have a dado stack to be able to do this. But there are a number of job site saws that take dado stacks, and there's even a dado stack for Europeans now. Oh, what a time to be alive. One thing to remember if you are using a job site table saw is you're probably going to be using a 6-inch dado stack, which is just going to leave a smaller cutout. But overall, this handhold method is not only functional, but it's quick and easy to do. And when compared to routing out a handhold, it's way less messy. And, at least according to my daughter, it looks pretty cool. And when it comes to routing, I'm just doing a 45-degree chamfer around the perimeter. And I'm not going to put a juice groove in because even though I like the way they look, I just never have a need for them. So what it would effectively do is just reduce the cutting area on the board for what would amount to a decoration for me. But what you may notice here is that I am routing backwards, or performing what's known as a climb cut. And for me, that's the best way I've found to eliminate tear out when routing these ingrain cutting boards. You'll also notice that my shop looks like I'm in the middle of a sandstorm with all the dust that this thing's kicking up. So you want to make sure you wear your respirator. As a matter of fact, my wife opened the door and quickly closed it back when she saw the big plume of dust in the air. And I'm sure she wanted something important, but we can't worry about that now. We've got to push forward with the routing. Now, I know everybody's favorite part is applying the oil, but one thing I never really see talked about are the considerations that you need to have when applying the finish in a non-temperature controlled garage shop. My shop is about 45 degrees in December, and when it's that cold, the wood fibers shrink and it's able to soak up a lot more oil. So when it soaks up all the oil that it'll take, I wipe off the excess and I take it inside. But inside it's like 30 degrees warmer. So the wood fibers expand and push out all that excess oil. So then your board just starts leaching oil all over the place. Which is fine, you just wipe it off, and then as it continues to leach more, you just keep wiping it off until it reaches equilibrium. So what you don't want to do is take it straight from your garage and give it to a loved one or a customer so that when they get it home, it just starts leaking oil all over the place like your first car in high school. After you put all the oil and the wax on, let it acclimate in your house first, then pass it on to its final owner. I like adding feet to my cutting boards because, one, it lets it sit a little bit higher, gives it a little bit more presence, and two, it's a bit of insurance just in case the owner doesn't quite care for it properly. As long as they sit it right side up, it'll always have air passing on all sides of it, which just makes it a little bit less likely for it to warp or crack. And the last step is to put board butter on it, which is just a mix of mineral oil and beeswax, and let it sit for a few minutes and then wipe it off. So in the end, how did we do? Were we able to get these for free? My mom chose the cherry one, and my sister chose the maple one, which left us the walnut one to try to sell. But I actually never listed it. We just ended up giving it to my other sister. My wife's sister, to be more specific. So in the end, I guess they weren't free after all. But, almost.